Founders usually can't tell whether a behavior has actually embedded itself in their team or whether they're still just carrying it themselves. And here's the really wild part. From inside the room, the two look exactly the same. When your team is small, culture feels organic, right? Everyone is just mimicking you. But true culture, that's what happens when you aren't there. Welcome to today's Explainer, Building Culture from Seed to Scale. We're going to figure out exactly how a culture stops being just the founder's shadow and transforms into this independent, self-sustaining system. We'll be using real data, psychological safety research, and some really cool habit formation science. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll cover the illusion of culture, the absence and pressure tests, small, scheduled, repeatable habits, how to build a strong feedback culture, listening and interface gaps, and finally, the true cost of delay. Let's dive right in. Section 1, the illusion of culture, the founder's trap. I want you to ask yourself a very direct question right now. Is your culture actually embedded, or are you just carrying it? In the early days, it's almost always the founder who notices an overloaded team member, or who sets the tone for a tricky customer interaction. But listen, when you are the only mechanism making a behavior happen, you're literally carrying it. And that has a hard ceiling. You just can't scale it. The contrast here is pretty stark. Carried behavior relies entirely on your presence, your intervention, your tone. Embedded behavior, on the other hand, runs completely on its own. Distribution happens when a manager's job changes, not when the founder just becomes, quote-unquote, more approachable. It's really about making your managers explicitly responsible for reinforcing these behaviors. Like, if a deadline is missed, an embedded culture asks what handover broke down, rather than just asking why the work is late. See the difference? Section 2, the absence and pressure tests. So how do you test this? Well, the test most founders reach for is their own absence. You know a behavior is embedded when it keeps happening without you in the room. But honestly, the much harder test is the pressure test. Does the behavior survive a really bad week? Does it survive a major pivot or high stress? Because behaviors that only run in calm, sunny conditions are basically just decoration. True culture holds up when it is highly inconvenient. Which brings us to Section 3, small, scheduled, repeatable habits. So how do we structurally build behaviors that can actually survive that kind of pressure? It starts with what occupational psychologists call keystone habits. These are routines that have the power to change how other habits work, producing these small wins that encourage widespread organizational change. Think of something like a simple Friday session where everyone shares just one assumption that changed that week. It's tiny, but it alters the entire team's perspective. It's like a domino effect. Looking at the source material, a fascinating pattern emerges. The culture mechanisms that actually survived scaling, they were never massive, expensive HR programs. What actually worked was small, scheduled, and repeatable stuff. A decision log, a Friday question, a feedback week where completion is actually checked. There are 3 non-negotiable conditions here. It must be consistent, it must be always scheduled, and it must be checked for completion. An idea only embeds if it has a dedicated slot on the calendar, and, this is crucial, someone who actually notices if it doesn't happen. And speaking of consistency, we have got to bust a popular myth right now. You've probably heard a million times that it takes 21 days to form a habit. Well, actually, scratch that. According to behavioral science, that's just a myth from the 1960s. Rigorous studies show it takes an average of 66 days for a new behavior to plateau in automaticity. So buckle up and be prepared to persevere well past that 3-week mark. To accelerate this process, top teams use something called implementation intentions. That's essentially just if-then planning. You link a specific situation to an action, so you define exactly when, where, and how you're going to do something. For example, if we make a product decision, then we will immediately write it in the weekly decision log. It totally shifts action control and saves your cognitive energy, so the behavior triggers automatically, based on context. All right, Section 4, build a strong feedback culture. When asked what they'd do a year earlier, almost all the founders in the data named candor. You might think a culture where everyone perfectly agrees is a positive one, right? Actually, no. A complete lack of conflict is a really bad sign. Harmony isn't always healthy. In early-stage companies, there's this massive temptation to protect the closeness of the team by just avoiding discomfort. We prioritize politeness. But avoiding difficult feedback doesn't protect trust. It actually weakens it over time. An embedded culture transitions from that polite silence to honest clarity. It's about naming tensions early and calmly, well before they boil over into real complaints. This brings us right to the core of the CELL framework for building a strong feedback culture. This gives us clear, well-structured tenets to take away. First, respectful challenge is an absolute requirement for inclusion. Think about it. If you can't challenge, you aren't fully included. Second, everyone must feel able to offer feedback regardless of their title. And third, safe disagreement fuels true innovation. Honestly, nothing exciting happens if people are too terrified to disagree. All of this relies on one very real clinical foundation: psychological safety. It's the belief that you won't be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. Trust is giving others the benefit of the doubt, sure, but psychological safety is believing that others will give you the benefit of the doubt when you take an interpersonal risk. When this is high in a team, learning and performance literally spike. Moving on to Section 5, listening and interface gaps. Catching unseen issues as you scale is so tricky. One founder shared how a severe burnout issue nearly caused a massive wave of resignations. And you know what the scariest part was? Quote, people were still delivering. The team was hitting all their metrics, which perfectly masked the fact that shifting priorities were destroying their ability to do deep work. Output metrics alone will absolutely lie to you. This is exactly why a passive open-door policy fails. The problems that nearly became crises were caught by designed listening, not an open door, because they only existed as a pattern across people. An open door really only catches extreme individual frustration, and usually only from your most extroverted people. Designed listening, on the other hand, uses scheduled instruments to spot systemic patterns across the whole team at once. It's a real game changer. And now our final part, Section 6, the true cost of delay. What founders assumed would sort itself out was never a person. It was a space between functions, like the gap between product and sales. And the assumption held precisely because everyone was capable and well-meaning. But when leaders stop designing those spaces, the bill always arrives twice. First for the structural fix, the reorganizations, the role changes, the new roles. And then it arrives again in confidence and cadence, where you're just waiting around for months to re-earn that team trust. It really all boils down to this fantastic quote: informal alignment does not scale. In the early days, hoping for the best and relying on physical proximity feels like it works. But as you grow, proximity is simply not an operating system. Which leaves us with a pretty provocative question to take back to your own teams. Are you designing the space between your people, or are you just assuming good intentions will build your culture? True culture isn't just a reflection of a founder's personality, it's the scheduled habits, the designed listening, and the safe feedback loops that run completely on their own the second you walk out of the room. Go audit your infrastructure today. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep designing those spaces.